Hi, my friends, have a good one for you today. This is a 2004 Volkswagen R32 turbocharged VR6. Now, this is not my 2004 R32 turbocharged VR6. Mine is actually just right over there in 1,000 pieces, and pieces over here, and pieces back here. But this car was towed to me because it won't start. I do have a little bit of details on the car, but I don't know everything. So we're gonna walk through the process of diagnosing it, hopefully fixing it, so be sure to watch the entire video to see if we actually get there and fix it. Now, short of pushing it in the shop, putting the hood light on it, and putting the battery charger on it, and pulling down the lower dash, and I'll tell you why in a second, I've not done anything to this car. I pulled down the lower dash because I was told that there's just a disaster of wiring up underneath the dash. Now, it actually doesn't look terrible under there, but as far as what's wired into what, that I don't have any clue. Now, this is a pretty modified car. As we can see, it's lowered. It's got a turbocharger on it. You can see the front mount charge cooler up in the front. This car's running a CTS turbo kit with United Motorsports software. The current owner is not the one that did the turbocharger kit. He bought it turbocharged, fixed a bunch of problems with the car, and then had it running. Well, eventually the car got to the point where it needed a slave cylinder. I don't remember exactly why. So transmission out, slave cylinder in, transmission back up, car runs really well. About a week after the car got the slave cylinder replaced, the current owner is backing out of the driveway, cut the wheel, boom, car shuts off. Just like you would if you turn the key off. This wasn't a sputter and die type thing. From that point on, the car would crank, but not start. Now, there's a handful of things we know. There's a handful of things we don't know, and a ton of stuff we don't know that we don't know, and some things we can assume one way or the other. So we know the car's modified. We know it's not on stock ECM. The current owner has swapped a handful of parts around, including an ECM, which didn't change, that the car cranks but does not start. It's probably not a crank position sensor. Typically, when these crank position sensors fail, which is common, you don't get an RPM on the tach while cranking. So we're not ruling the G28 out, but it's probably not that. We can also probably assume it's not an immobilizer issue. Typically, immobilizer failures on Volkswagens results in the car starting, running for about 1 second, and then shutting right back off. In our case, the car's never starting. Not gonna completely rule it out, but it's probably not either one of those two things. We can, in a way, assume that the starter's good because it does in fact crank. So that means the relay's probably good and the starter's probably good. Now, it may not be, but we can assume at least parts of that system are good. So we're not gonna push starter all the way up to the beginning point of our diagnostic list. While we might have a bad starter not spinning fast enough, it's not high on my priority list. And allegedly, there are no fault codes stored in the ECM, but we'll hook up the scan tool and confirm that. One of my favorite early steps when you have an unknown car with really, honestly, unknown mods doing something wrong is to start with a visual inspection. We know the car had work recently, but not right before it failed. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a problem related to the work that was done, and transmission out can be a pretty major repair, especially when you see how shoehorned this turbocharger setup is in. We're gonna start our visual inspection under the hood and see what we got going on. So we'll notice right away that our injectors have different connectors on them. These are upgraded injectors. Look at how shoehorned this turbocharger setup is inside of this car. So we want to take a really good look at what's going on here, and in a second we'll crank it and actually see what it sounds like. But I'm just looking for anything just blatantly obvious, like the air intake not being attached or something like that. It looks like all this stuff is on here pretty well. Nothing glaring, nothing obvious, nothing unplugged. Now, a common thing on modified Volkswagen, especially like the Mark IV 1.8 turbos, is O2 sensor wiring getting smashed. Having some concern about maybe O2 sensor wiring, if you look way down there, oh boy, okay. So I don't know that we found the problem yet, but if we look way down there, we can see that the firewall and the downpipe are pretty close, and it almost looks like there's some wires maybe touching or a little smashed. So those are O2 sensor wires, which are not fused. That's something we're gonna take a better look at when we get the car up in the air. I wanna show you guys that wiring. Well, I hope you heard that. The fuel pump does prime, and wow, 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 that is loud. I'm guessing, based on the modifications, it's probably an upgraded fuel pump. So here's our wiring spaghetti that the owner was talking about. This should be for like boost gauge stuff and all kinds of things. It does have this P3 gauge and a couple of other gauges here as well. Our fuse panel, looks like there's fuses in every slot, but we'll check those and make sure that they're actually good. Let's go ahead and open the shop door up, crank it, and see what it sounds like. All right, here we go. All right, so it does in fact crank. Something else that I always pay attention to whenever I'm cranking a car that won't start, if it has a tach, I like to watch to see if the tach actually shows an RPM. So we do have RPM, it does crank. Now, it sounded weird cranking. Not so much like it had no compression, but maybe even like a weak compression. I don't know how long this car's been cranked or anything like that, so that may be related, but that definitely didn't sound ideal. I think I'm actually going to also crank it again while standing under the hood, so I'm gonna need someone else to crank it for me or get one of those starter buttons. We'll put that on the back burner until I can get an extra set of hands to crank the car. In the meantime, let's do some really easy basic stuff. Check our fuses and things like that to be sure we don't just have a blown fuse or something dumb like that causing our no start condition. While we're here, I'm actually gonna just do a quick test on the battery. Now, I flipped up the fuse panel for the fuse on top of the battery. We can see this alternator fuse is very, very, very unhappy. This probably won't cause it to not start, but it's for sure an issue. So if you're taking notes, you wanna write something like that down. All right, so this is telling us that we do have a good battery, so that's good. While we're here, since this little machine can do this, let's go ahead and do a starter test too. Crank engine until starts. Well, that might be a problem, friend. Cranking test, volt drop normal. This says it's actually okay, so we're gonna go with that and move on to checking all of our fuses. All right, let's buzz these fuses. We're gonna use a trusty power probe. Now, I'm not gonna be able to test all of them. Some of them are closed off, but we'll handle that when we get to it. For right now, let's just turn our key on, get our battery charger hooked back up, and test some fuses. Ooh. So I actually pulled this fuse out, and while this fuse looks good, it looks like there's some crusty stuff inside of here. So I'm gonna actually pull this fuse panel out and see if we can get a better look at how much crust is inside of there. In the meantime though, I am gonna pull all these fuses out and just take a look at them. Now, one, just pulling a fuse and looking at it doesn't always tell you whether the fuse is actually good. Two, if you are going to do this, this is so important, take out one at a time. Don't take them all out and check them and then put them all back in thinking you're gonna remember where they went. Just do one at a time. Trust me, I've seen people mess that up so many times. We'll just simply pull them out, do a quick inspection and make sure it's not blown. But after finding some nasty yuck inside of there, we gotta deal with that anyway. There's another one, this right here, full of yuck. So when I pulled this fuse, the fans kicked on high speed. Let's go ahead and set that one to the side. He's got a couple extra ones in here. I'm gonna grab one of these, put that fuse in. And the reason I did that is the fuse looked a little unhappy. This is another one that doesn't really look all that happy. So all these appear, anyway, on the surface to be good. I'm not sure that this is really causing our issue. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna undo these bolts. I'm gonna pull this whole panel away and try and take the backing plate off of the fuse panel just to see how bad it is. It may not be anything to worry about, but I wanna know before we really move on to the next step. So here's the good thing. This fuse panel is not full of rust or crust or anything super nasty. We'll have to address that fuse thing in a little bit. We can also take our power probe here now from the back side and probe and see if we got power on both sides of each of these terminals. That should have power. Okay, so nothing like crazy glaring, at least from just a basic fuse standpoint. Contamination up here in this corner will have to be addressed at some point, but we're not gonna worry about that too terribly much right now. Let's actually get the car up in the air and take a look at the bottom side and see if there's anything that stands out. I also want to try and get a better look at those oxygen sensor wires that were smashed between the downpipe and the firewall. Okay. If you ever wonder why shops charge extra for lowered cars, that's why. Normally it's not a big deal when you can drive them up on the blocks, but boy, that Not ideal. Let's get up underneath this thing and take a look and see what's going on. So we're noticing that we're missing the belly pan, not really a huge deal. Because we know that there was recently work done to this, I want to kind of focus on the transmission area that would have been removed in order to replace that slave cylinder. So we kind of want to focus there. I also am going to try and get a better look at where that O2 sensor wire looked to be smashed between the downpipe and the firewall. We'll probably end up pulling this cover off here and taking a much deeper look, looking very closely at these oxygen sensors and wiring. Here's some more wiring that's exposed. Fuel pump back here. Still haven't ruled out fuel being part of the issue. Now what I want to see is actually buried way up in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my bore scope and see if I can get a better look. Now I can kind of see okay just with my eyeballs, but no way I'm going to be able to show you guys what's going on up there. All right, so we did our quick visual inspection. We checked our fuses. We found that mess of wiring underneath the dash. Car's up in the air. I pulled the sheathing back on those O2 sensor wires that looked like they were jammed between the firewall and between the downpipe. It doesn't really look like anything's major. However, we are still not eliminating that as a possibility for our no start condition. See, what I've seen happen is those O2 sensor wires actually get pinched and grounded. This sends a dead signal back to the ECM and actually cooks the ECM. This is a really common thing on lower cars, especially when you hit something and it snatches all those O2 sensor wires out of this junction. I think now's a good time to go ahead and run that full scan and see if we have any red flags there. While the VCDS is running, we have some extra time. The older cars take forever to run a full scan. I thought I'd come in here and poke around with our dash and some of this aftermarket stuff that we have installed on our car. Check out what I found. So ignition is off. When we push the hazard button, it clicks. We only have one turn signal indicator actually flashing. And look at the oil pressure gauge. It's clicking kind of in unison with our hazard relay, as well as these gauges up here are also turning on and off. So clearly something is unhappy underneath the dash of this car. I talked to the owner of the vehicle, the current owner, and he said that this has actually been happening since he's owned the car and that it's not necessarily related to the no start concern. Now, I'm not ruling out that this is not related. However, if it was doing it before the car wouldn't start, this is not going to be my main focus. It is just kind of cool, though, to watch it flash like that. See, a step like this is important when you have a little bit of downtime waiting for a scan tool or something. Do something, poke around, press buttons, and you might just actually accidentally anyway stumble upon something that may not be the problem, but you can either confirm it's something that we need to address or rule it out as an issue. Also, poking around here under the hood, I found that this clamp right here is loose. So I don't think this is going to cause our no start either. However, it's going to make taking this pipe off super easy. So we may just pop this off and take a look, see if there's anything, maybe something got sucked down in the turbocharger, and that's the reason for our no start. Okay, so we have our VCDS up, and boy, we got a couple of faults here to look at. When we start in our engine, we see that we have two faults stored for the cam position sensor and cam position sensor bank 2, G40 and G163. Now, initially, I was like, hey, Eureka, we have a timing issue. However, this may actually not be the case. Before this car got towed to me, I actually had some telediagnosis time with the owner of the car. One thing I had him do was flip-flop the two connectors. See, a lot of times these two plugs get plugged in backwards. The wires for the sensors reach about the same distance, and they both plug in, so it's a pretty easy thing to get wrong. This is, however, before I knew that the car had ran post another repair. Actually, let's go ahead and check and make sure that these are either right or wrong. So when we compare the wiring diagram, the connector with the lilac and brown wire in pin location number 2 is actually G40, so that's going to be our front one. These are still flipped. I'm going to go ahead and flip them back, so at least we have that correct. The other couple of issues we look at, we have a battery voltage too low, not a big deal. Of course, it was low from all the cranking. Another one that I'm a little concerned about, I don't think it's causing our no start problem, but I am a bit concerned about, is going to be our engine control unit not currently testable intermittent. I haven't really done any research on this fault, but I also don't recall ever seeing this. Now, when I was poking around with the turn signals and the hazards and all the gauges flashing and everything, noticing that the cluster wasn't behaving properly either, I dug into the wiring diagram a tiny bit and found that all that stuff shares the same ground. So I think we have a ground issue with this control unit not ready and all the stuff flicking and flashing and whatnot. But because the car ran while this stuff was also going on, I'm not going to jump right to fixing that yet. Okay, so we have our two cam position sensor faults. Now, when I was looking in the wiring diagram to make sure that they were plugged in correctly, I noted that they share two separate connections. They share ground, and they probably share what is a power, and then the signal back is the difference of the two sensors. So we could very easily have an electrical issue in the ECM or somewhere in the wiring where one of those two wires is, let's say, broken or shorted, and it's causing a problem with both of those. Not knowing where the cams are might cause a no start. However, I've actually seen those faults be stored and the car still start. So I think we're going to start down the path of those cam position sensors and make sure that we don't have an issue there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, just because it's the easiest thing in the world, is I'm just going to make sure that our engine is actually turning. There's something interesting that I noticed when I first looked at the car. So an early step in always in every car I look at is to take the oil fill cap off and just look down in the engine. And I noticed that the cam variator on the intake cam was in a certain spot. So what I'm going to be looking for is I'm going to be looking for that to move. That's not good at all. Remember back to earlier in the video when I said it does crank. Now, it sounded weird. Trust your gut, my friends, because that's exactly what's wrong. If you'll notice, the cams aren't turning. However, when we slide over, we can see that we know the crank is turning. All the accessory stuff is turning as well. You can see the alternator turning here. So we have some kind of timing issue. So I should have trusted my gut on that first one and just checked. However, I also think it's important. Don't get caught up in the jump to the thing you just maybe think it is. There's still some other checks that you want to do. Now, if this were in the dealership and I wasn't filming a video for you guys, we would probably be 15 to 20 minutes in at this point in time based on everything that we've done so far, especially if you remove playing around with all the electronics in the car, because boy, that's a lot of fun. Okay, we're gonna commit a bit of a sin here, and the curiosity is killing me, so we're gonna go ahead and take this valve cover off without talking to the customer. Shops, don't ever do this. Once you start going into the engine, you really wanna make sure you're talking to your customer. Also, because this has the short runner intake on it, taking the valve cover off is super simple. If this had the hole over the valve cover intake manifold, the factory one, and we'd had to put it in service position, I probably wouldn't do this. However, I think with how easy this is, 15 bolts or something like that, it's gonna be easy enough to just pop this cover off and take yet another look to see what's going on. Okay, so now that we have the valve cover off, let's get our bore scope down and see if we can get a better look at what's going on. This is actually a pretty solid quality bore scope for like 150 bucks. I'll throw a link down in the description if you want to check it out. As we slide here back past the exhaust cam and get, oh my goodness, all the way down, we can actually see there's a broken link right there on the top. How kind of awesome is that? Boy, there's a lot of cracked and broken stuff down here. We would have a few choices. Obviously, this is going to be a transmission out type of repair because we're going to be focusing on the bottom chain and the bottom end. This is a highly modified car, so at this point, we would definitely want to pull the camshafts out, do a cylinder leak down test. I would probably just go ahead and pull the cylinder head off and send it to the machine shop, get it checked. This was a pretty low RPM situation where this failed. However, because it's been cranked a bunch and may run into a bent valve issue. Okay, so I actually planned for that to be the ending of the video. I even have the entire rest of the video completely edited. However, the curiosity to need to know more has been driving me insane. So I decided to put my gloves back on and go a little bit deeper. My initial plan is to drain all the engine oil and pull the oil pan. That's a pretty easy, straightforward thing to do. That way we can evaluate any pieces and yuck down in the bottom end. Depending on what we find there, I'll probably end up going ahead and pulling that upper timing cover off as well so that we can get a better look at what's going on behind those timing covers. We won't see everything without the transmission completely out, but I think we'll be able to get a better idea of the extent of the damage by doing those two things. Okay, with our oil pan off, you can see we got some chunkage here. This is plastic right there. What is this? More plastic. I'm guessing this is all bits of guide rail. There's a bunch more plastic back there. Some pretty sizable chunks. Wow. More back in here. So a lot of plastic down in the pan. I don't see any metal. All right, so as you can see, oh man, I don't mean to laugh, but geez Louise, here's our timing chain just hanging down. I couldn't really see too terribly much up here where the timing chain rides. Maybe it's time to break the bore scope back out and see what we got. Not really any metal in the pickup or plastic or anything like that, so we're good there. Let's see what we can find with our bore scope. Okay, so while we're at this level of apartness, why don't we go ahead and pull our spark plugs out. Then what we can do is we can grab the bore scope and drop the bore scope down in the cylinders, take a look and see if we can see anything really, really catastrophic going on. We'll go ahead and start with cylinder 1. This mark right here, this is actually a recess cut in the piston, but as you can see, there's a bit of marking on the cylinder wall. That could be of a concern. Well, there's no bits of valve or anything laying in there. Let's move on to number 2. Looks like our piston's pretty high up. You can see right there on the right side of your screen, those 2 little circles are exhaust valves, which is okay because it looks like our cam is actually holding those exhaust valves open. Let's see if we can rotate that around. I don't see anything major there. Move on to number 3. Looks like 3's got our intake valves open. I'm not sure if that's impact damage here on the right from a valve or just a shiny spot from my light on the bore scope. Again, there's another spot where I can't quite tell if that's just a shiny spot or there was actually some impact damage. Well, I don't see anything like completely obvious and glaring in these cylinders. However, I'm also not convinced that this bore scope is telling the full story. All right, we got the upper timing cover off, and the upper timing cover looks pretty good. Nothing to really worry too terribly much about there. Let's drop our bore scope down behind our lower timing cover and see. We got some scoring on that gear right there. There's our busted link. That looks like part of a gear right there. I wonder if this gear, this intermediate gear, is the culprit. Oh, yep, it sure is. Right there, look. You can see that gear has just come apart. Dang, sad. Look, looks like there's some scoring on that cover there. Bits of metal, that's part of that gear right there. So I'm guessing that is a guide that broke. Or is that pin just laying there? Oh, so that's just laying there. I wonder if that bolt backed out or broke. That's what caused all this carnage. More of the gear down there. Clearly, we're gonna need a whole timing set, including both of these gears. That's what, so this crack right here, this chunk missing, is out of the lower timing cover. You gotta hope at this point that there's no damage to the block, because if there's damage to the block, it's game over. So I'm actually really glad that we went even deeper in it because we got to see some of that cool carnage up front. Whether it was that pin bolt breaking, causing all the damage, or whether it was a gear breaking, really hard to tell. My guess is that pin broke, tumbled around, broke the chain, and caused all that damage. Really now at this point, as far as I would be concerned, the next step for this thing is engine out, completely torn down, full inspection, every bearing, every nut, every bolt. I wouldn't risk it on a high horsepower car. Honestly, even on a stock car, it's probably worth doing all that anyway, but because this is a performance car, definitely want to do it, which stinks because we didn't even address the electrical gremlins that the car clearly has. So I hope you stuck around for the ending here. Really cool stuff. And unfortunately, it's just a super bummer for the guy that owns it. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to put it back together and let him decide whether he wants to rebuild it, replace it, or what he's going to do. With that, I'm out. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye.